You will never be alone. The same Lord who was with me in prison will be with you on the journey. I promise, Paul. I will preach even if my voice trembles, even if I stand alone." He was more than a disciple. Was Paul's spiritual heir, the apostle who changed the course of faith. Timothy grew up amid shadows and promises, never imagining that destiny would choose him to continue a mission that would be born amid prisons, tears, and miracles. But behind the letters and the sermons, there was a secret. Something Paul revealed only to him. A truth so profound it had remained hidden for generations. A mystery hidden between the lines, sealed by time and protected by the silence of those who knew too much. What did Paul entrust to Timothy that the world could not hear? Why has this truth been kept from the eyes of history? And what really happened in the days when faith was persecuted and every word could cost one's life? Get ready to find out Timothy's hidden truth, the disciple who kept the Apostle Paul's greatest secret and whose silent faith became the link between the end of an era and the beginning of eternity. Join us on this journey back to the earliest days of the church when a young man called Timothy was chosen to follow the Apostle Paul and carry a legacy that would change the history of faith. He wasn't looking for fame, just to understand the calling that made him leave everything behind. Prepared to meet the disciple who learned that being faithful to God means walking even when fear screams louder than hope. "Mother, why doesn't Father ever pray with us?" Timothy asked as the flame of the lamp flickered in the small stone room. "Because your father sees the world differently," my son Eunice replied calmly, running a hand through the boy's hair. "He believes in the power of men, not in the voice of God." Timothy, whose name means he who honors God, was born in Lystra, an ancient city in Ionia, in the mountainous region of Asia Minor. It was a place of contrasts where the dry wind blew between yellowish hills and where altars dedicated to Zeus shared space with small synagogues. The people of Lystra lived between superstition and faith, between the voices of Greek philosophers and the prayers of the Jews. It was there that little Timothy opened his eyes to a confusing world and to a calling he did not yet understand. His father was Greek, a learned and respected man who believed that human destiny was in their own hands. His name was Nika, descended from a line of soldiers and thinkers. For him the gods were symbols, not realities. His mother Eunice was Jewish with a heart that feared the Lord. She came from a pious family faithful to the scriptures. The daughter of Lois, a woman of prayer whose faith had spanned generations. Among them, Timothy grew up divided, his heart drawn to heaven but his mind drawn to reason. From a young age he had learned the scrolls of the law, and Eunice made him repeat the words of Moses here. "O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." Deuteronomy 6:2-4. But at night his father would sit him by the fire and talk about the great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, men who, according to Nicanor, had discovered the power of free thought. "The gods are ideas, my son," said the father, tracing figures in the sand with a twig. "The wise man is the one who understands the world without needing to fear it." Eunice, listening from afar, sighed silently. Timothy didn't know what to feel. He loved his father's wisdom, but his heart warmed when his mother spoke of the God of Abraham. One morning he saw Eunice and Lois kneeling beside the well, praying as the sun rose behind the hills. The cool breeze touched his face and he heard his grandmother say, "One day the Lord will raise up men who will proclaim his word to all nations." The boy kept that phrase in his heart, not knowing that one day it would come true for him. In the afternoons, he would run through the streets of Lystra watching the caravans coming from afar. Merchants, soldiers, and wise men crossed the city's paths. Some spoke of war, others of temples and gods. But an old storyteller, always sitting near the walls, said something that intrigued him. "I heard about a prophet who came from Judea preaching that the kingdom of God was near." Timothy listened to him in silence, feeling his heart burn, as if those words were seeds thrown into fertile soil. At night, while her father watched the sky and talked about constellations, Eunice told him stories of faith, of Abraham who believed against hope, of David who defeated giants, of Elijah who prayed and fire came down. "Mother, does the same God still speak to us?" he asked once, his eyes fixed on the flame. "Speak, my son, but you must have a clean heart to hear his voice. What if I can't understand? Then ask him to teach you." "The heart that seeks the truth," Eunice said, holding her son's hands, "will eventually find the way." These words were engraved on Timothy like an invisible mark. He began to pray alone, hidden in a field behind his house, where the hills echoed his words. The wind seemed to answer his questions, and even without understanding he felt he was not alone. Time passed and the distance between his parents grew. Nicanor respected his wife's faith, but he didn't understand it. Sometimes he looked at his son with pride, sometimes with concern. "If you keep listening to these stories, you'll never be strong, Timothy. The world belongs to those who act, not to those who wait." "Father, what if strength comes from God?" the boy replied, unaware of the courage in his own voice. Nicanor fell silent, his gaze lost in the flame. "Then may he teach you what I could not," he replied with a heavy sigh. That night, Timothy left home and walked to the field where he usually prayed. The sky was clear, dotted with stars, and the silence felt sacred. He lay down on the grass and gazed at the vastness above him. The cold wind enveloped him, and a strange sensation swept over him as if a presence surrounded him. "Lord," he murmured, "if my mother's God is real, show me who you are." The clouds moved slowly, and a star shone with unusual intensity. Timothy felt his heart race. Something inside him was awakening, a faith, still unformed, but alive. It was just the beginning of a journey that would pass through cities, prisons, shipwrecks, and tears. But that night in Lystra, all little Timothy knew was that there were two voices calling inside him, one from earth and one from heaven. And when I looked up at the sky that night, I had the impression that someone was watching me. And I didn't know whether to smile or fear. Mom, ever since that night, I can't stop thinking. It's as if heaven is calling me, but I don't understand what it wants of me. Timothy said, his eyes fixed on the field where he was praying. Sometimes God begins to speak before we know how to listen, Eunice replied, adjusting her cloak on her shoulders. When the time is right, he will show you the way. The sun had barely risen over the hills of Lystra when a traveler entered the main road. His face was sunburnt, his feet were bruised, and his gait was weary. But his eyes seemed to hold something eternal. People stopped to watch him, some with curiosity, others with contempt. The man's expression bore the serenity of one who has suffered but found peace. His name was Paul. He sought refuge in a city that knew little about true faith. Lystra was torn between the reasoning of the Greeks and the hope of the Jews. The temples to Zeus still smoked incense, and the streets smelled of dust and confusion. But that day the stranger began to speak. Paul stood in the middle of the square and raised his voice. "Men of Lystra, I bring you good news of a God who does not live in temples made by human hands. He sent his son Jesus, who died for us and rose again on the third day." The words echoed between the stone walls. The children stopped. The elders glanced at each other, and even the soldiers looked away. It was as if the wind had changed direction. Timothy approached, curious. He had never heard anyone speak with such authority and tenderness at the same time. Paul didn't seem like a philosopher nor a wise man. He spoke as if he had seen the truth. "And this Jesus still lives," the apostle continued. "I saw him myself when he persecuted me and cast down my pride. He transformed the persecutor into a servant, the enemy into a messenger." Timothy's heart burned. Each word seemed to touch a dormant chord within him. He remembered his mother's stories and his grandmother Lois's faith. Everything that had once been doubt now took shape. He looked at Eunice, who was listening in the distance, and saw tears in her eyes. Later, as night fell, Timothy went to where the traveler was resting. Paul was sitting by the light of a lamp, wrapping a cloth around the wounds on his feet. The young man approached hesitantly. "Lord, I heard you speak today. Your words touched me more than anything. Who is this Christ you proclaim?" Paul lifted his face, and his gaze rested on him calmly and deeply. "He is the Son of the living God," he replied. "He who came to seek the weary, the lost, those who thirst for truth. And did you know him?" "Yes, on the road to Damascus. When I was an enemy of the faith, he surrounded me with a light no man could withstand. I fell to the ground blind and humiliated, and when I regained my sight, everything I was died. Since then, I have lived only to make him known." Timothy felt a shiver run down his spine. That voice wasn't that of a storyteller. It was that of someone who had stood before Christ himself. "What if he calls me to?" the boy asked sincerely. Paulo smiled slightly. "Then don't resist. When he calls, it's because he's already prepared the way." The next day, Paul returned to the marketplace and preached again. He spoke of forgiveness, of love for enemies, of a kingdom that never ends. His words set hearts ablaze. Even those who mocked fell silent. A crippled man who had never walked heard and believed. Paul looked at him and said in a loud voice, "In the name of Jesus Christ, get up and walk." And the man stood up. The people screamed. Some fell to their knees. Others fled in fright. List had never seen anything like it. In that instant, Timothy understood his mother's God was real. The faith he had heard in the prayers of Eunice and Lois was no ancient echo. It was life pulsing before him. But along with faith came the weight of choice. Following Paul meant leaving everything behind. His home, the mountains, the arms that raised him. That night, the silence was heavy. Eunice lit the lamp and found him sitting at the table watching the fire. "You're going to leave with him, aren't you?" he asked quietly. I don't know, Mom, but something inside me pushes me. If it is God who calls you, do not fear. I gave you to him before you were even born. May the faith I gave you be your strength now." She hugged him tenderly, and tears wet her son's shoulder. Dawn arrived, and the cold wind blew through the windows. Timothy left the house, walked to the road, and saw in the distance Paul preparing to leave. The apostle looked back one last time. His eyes, deep, serene, eternal, met Timothy's. No words were spoken, there was no need. The young man felt his heart sink. He wanted to run, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. He stood still until the first ray of sunlight touched the stones of the road, and then he realized, "Mother, when the sun rose, I saw Paulo leave, and I discovered that I could no longer stay. Mum, I went after him." Tohio's voice trembled as he said goodbye. "I don't know what awaits me, but I know I can't go back." Eunice held his hands tenderly. "Go, my son. The same God who guided Abraham will guide you. 2 tears flowed silently. May the Lord make you a man of faith. The road to Lystra disappeared between hills and dust. The sun burned the skin and the wind carried the smell of distant campfires. Timothy walked beside Paul and Silas, silently observing the man with his firm steps and calm gaze. It was hard to believe that the same Paul, once a persecutor, now surrendered himself so peacefully to the Christ he preached. "Are you tired, son?" asked the apostle, noticing the young man's weariness. "A little, but it's different. It's not just the body, it's the heart." Timothy looked at the horizon. "I'm afraid of what's to come." "It is good to be afraid," Paul replied. "It reminds us that we depend on God." As evening approached, they came to a small village. The people gathered in the square. Some received the message with joy, others with anger. Paul climbed onto a rock and began to preach. "Men, women, young people, the God who made heaven and earth sent his Son to give us life. Salvation is not in the hands of the strong, but in the hands of the repentant." As he spoke, a group of religious men approached. Their faces were set like stone. One of them shouted, "Liar! You bring confusion to our people." Paul didn't answer. He continued preaching, and this infuriated the men. Soon stones began flying. One hit Silas on the shoulder. Another passed near Timothy, who fell to the ground frightened. Suddenly they brought a Christian man tied up and threw him before the crowd. "That's one of your followers," they shouted. "Let's show them what happens to those who follow this Christ." Timothy, his hands were shaking. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. The apostle knelt down without fear. "Lord Jesus, receive the spirit of your servant," Paul prayed as the man was stoned before them. The sound of stones striking flesh echoed like thunder. Timothy closed his eyes, but tears escaped. When he opened them again, he saw the martyr's face turned toward the heavens, a smile on his lips. Blood flowed onto the ground. The crowd dispersed. Murmuring, Paul approached the body, wiped the man's face, and prayed softly. Timothy knelt beside him, his heart aching. "Why don't you rebel, Paulo?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why don't you fight against them?" Paulo looked at him tenderly. "Because there is glory in those who suffer for love. The world doesn't understand this, Timothy, but heaven does." The young man lowered his head, trying to hold back his tears. The martyr's blood mingled with the dust, and the wind carried the smell of iron and pain. For the first time, he understood that following Jesus was not a path of applause, but of wounds. At night, the silence was heavy. They sat near a fire, the glow of the flames illuminating their tired faces. "I thought faith was joy, but today I saw that it is also pain," said Timothy, looking at the embers. "It's both," Paul replied. "Faith is the flame that burns even when everything around is dark, and that's what the world will see in you." Silas approached, placing a cloth over the boy's shoulders. "Fear not, brother. Every drop of blood shed for Christ becomes a seed, and the seeds grow even under the rocks." Timothy nodded silently. His heart ached, but something new was being born within him. Courage. The next morning, before they left, Paul knelt before the martyr's body and said, "Faith does not end with death. It begins with it. May this man's example remind us that the gospel is stronger than hatred." The apostle stood up and looked at Timothy. "Are you ready to move on?" The young man took a deep breath. There, but different. They walked in silence along the road. The sun was rising and the ground still bore dark stains of dried blood. Timoteo looked back one last time. The village seemed distant, but the sound of the stones still echoed within him. "Paulo," he called, his voice low. "Now I understand why the path of light is so narrow." The apostle turned with a look that mixed firmness and compassion. "'Cause light does not fear darkness, Timothy. It passes through it." The young man walked a few more steps, looking at the stained ground, his heart burning like the morning fire. "That day I understood that the path to light begins with steps on blood." Before we continue with this intense part of the story, I want to ask you for a simple but powerful gesture. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This way you help us continue producing inspiring stories like that of Timothy, the young man who discovered that faith is not the absence of pain, but the strength that arises within it. Now come back with me to the road where Paul and Timothy faced persecution, doubts, and revelations that would forever change the destiny of the church. "Paul, will fear ever go away?" Timothy asked as they walked along the silent road under a sky covered in heavy clouds. "No, my son," the apostle replied calmly. "Fear does not go away, but faith learns to walk even when trembling." The hills were shrouded in mist, and the night wind carried the distant sound of wolves. The group moved slowly, seeking shelter before the rain. Their worn sandals marked the dust of the path, and only the light of a small lamp guided their steps. Paul walked ahead, praying softly. Silas followed closely behind, scanning the horizon. Timothy, weary, came last, struggling to keep pace. Suddenly a shadow appeared between the trees. A tall man wrapped in a dark cloak approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good evening, travelers," he said, bowing his head. "May I walk with you for a while?" Paulo nodded gently and the stranger joined them. His voice was soft, almost hypnotic. "I've heard of a man named Paul. They say he performs miracles and speaks in the name of a certain Christ. He paused, glancing sideways at the apostle. But they also say he once persecuted the very people he now defends. Timothy felt his heart sink. Those words hurt him more than he cared to admit. Is it true? The stranger asked with a thin smile. Can someone change that much, or are there secrets behind every miracle? Paulo didn't answer. He continued walking silent as if listening but unmoved. Silas looked intently at his visitor. Tongues lie easily when the heart is hollow, he said dryly. The man laughed. So young and already so faithful. Be careful, boy. Not all faith is pure. When the rain began to fall, they sought shelter in an old abandoned house by the roadside. A fire was lit, and the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. Demetrio huddled close to the heat, but the stranger approached him, whispering, "Open your eyes, boy. Holy men also bleed inside. Glory has a price, and it's not always paid with purity." Timothy looked at him confused. "What do you mean? I just want you to see for yourself." The man touched his shoulder and smiled. "Not everyone who shines comes from the light." Before he could answer, Paul stood up and prayed aloud, "Lord, deliver us from the voices that sow doubt. May your spirit be our guide in the desert." The stranger just laughed, lifted his hood, and disappeared into the darkness. Silence returned, but not peace. The man's words echoed in Timothy's mind. He looked at Paul, trying to find some sign of falsehood, some gesture of pride. He found nothing, only wariness and true faith. Even so, the poison of doubt had already been released. In the following days, he began to observe the apostle more closely. When Paul prayed for a sick person, Timothy wondered if it was truly God's power at work. When Paul wept silently at night, he wondered if it was guilt or repentance. And each question dug deeper into the pit within his heart. One afternoon, while they were resting near a stream, Timothy approached the master. "Paulo, can I ask you something?" "Of course, son. When you speak of Christ, it seems like you see him before you. But what if it's just a beautiful memory, a hope created by pain?" Paulo looked at him tenderly, without offense, without haste. "Hope is not born of pain, Timothy. It is born of love. I do not follow a memory. I follow a presence." "But what if one day the Lord leaves you?" the young man insisted, distressed. "Then I will still love him," the apostle replied, smiling. "Because those who truly love don't need to understand everything. They just need to trust." Tosio remained silent. The wind rustled the leaves, and the murmur of the water seemed to echo the master's words. Even so, doubt wouldn't leave him alone. That night, the young man dreamed of the man in the cloak. He smiled, whispering the same words. "Paulo is not who he appears to be. There are shadows behind the light." Timoteo woke up sweating, his heart racing. The next day dawned heavy. The group continued on their journey, and the silence between master and disciple became an invisible wall. Paul glanced at Timothy, noticing the weight on his face. "Is everything okay with you, my son?" he asked calmly. Timoteo hesitated. "Yes, he is just tired. Tired of body or heart." He looked away. "Both, maybe." Paulo said nothing more. But before the sun set, he placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Doubt is a seed, Timothy. If watered, it grows like a weed, but if exposed to light, it dies." The young man nodded, not having the courage to confess what he felt. As dusk fell, they camped under a large oak tree. Silas slept, and the wind rustled through the leaves. Timothy watched the flames and for a moment thought he saw the man's figure in the shadows of the road. He got up startled, but there was no one there. "Paulo," she called, her voice trembling. "What if the faith I carry is just fear in disguise?" The apostle opened his eyes and looked at him for a long time. "So, my son, it's time to let fear speak until it discovers that it was always God who called it by name." "So, my son, it's time to let fear speak until it discovers that it was always God who called it by name," said Paulo in a calm voice while the night fire illuminated their tired faces. Timoteo fell silent. The crackling of the embers seemed to mark the rhythm of his heart. The cold wind passed and the flames flickered as if they too felt doubt. The road was long and dusty. In the morning, the group resumed their journey, Paul in front, Silas at his side, and two other men who had recently joined, including one named Dees, a young man, soft-spoken and with an easy smile. He claimed to have left everything to follow the gospel, but his eyes sometimes shone strangely, as if he were observing more than listening. "Timothy, walk with me," Paul urged as they climbed a hill. "The path of discipleship is made of slow steps but with a firm heart." "I still have doubts," the young man confessed. "I tried to believe, but sometimes my heart is divided." "God works even in broken hearts," the apostle replied. "Doubt when brought to prayer turns into faith." The sun was blazing hot when they arrived at a village near the border. The people, simple and suspicious, watched as strangers. Paul preached in a small square, and many listened attentively. He spoke of forgiveness, of love that conquers evil, of the Christ who died for all. But as he preached, Timothy noticed Demos moving away, talking secretly with two men by the wall. "Silas," whispered the young man, "did you see what he does? Maybe he's just asking for directions." "Maybe," Timothy replied without conviction. That night, the group camped outside the village. The moon rose high, and the silence felt heavy. Deimos laughed to himself, telling old stories, trying to hide his uneasiness. Paul, as always, prayed quietly. Timothy watched his companion from afar, his heart weary. Hours later, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the trees. Lanterns appeared in the darkness. Soldiers shouted, Silas, rising to his feet. The group surrounded the camp. They were armed men with torches and spears. The commander spoke harshly. We are looking for Paul of Tarsus, they say. He is here disturbing the cities with false doctrines. Timothy looked around, his heart racing. Then he saw Deimos standing a few steps behind the soldiers. His gaze avoided his companions, but guilt was written all over his face. It was you, Timothy murmured, incredulous. Deimos lowered his eyes. I did what was right. I don't want to die for a dream. Paul stepped forward, hands raised. Do not be afraid, he said to the soldiers. I do not bring swords. I bring words, and words do not kill. They liberate, but they wouldn't listen. One of the guards pushed the apostle violently. Tie him up. Silas tried to intervene, but Paulo stopped him with a gesture. Leave it, brother. The gospel needs no defense by human hands. The soldiers dragged him for a few meters until suddenly one of the village leaders appeared. He was an elderly man with a tired look. Release him, he ordered. This man has done nothing against us. He only talks about the God of the Jews. The guards hesitated, then retreated. Paulo remained standing, wounded, but calm. As the men walked away, Deimos disappeared into the shadows. The group fell silent. No one had the strength to speak. Timothy sat by the fire, feeling the weight of betrayal. How could he? Paul. He walked with us, shared bread, prayed beside you. The apostle looked at the flames. There are those who walk with us, Timothy, but not with the same heart. Not all who follow the master remain when the wind blows against them. Silas looked at the horizon, dejected. The enemy doesn't always have to attack from outside. Sometimes he whispers within the camp. Paulo nodded. That is why faith must be born in silence, where only God can hear. The rest of the night passed slowly. The fire crackled, but no one slept. Timothy felt a mixture of anger and sadness within him. He looked at the apostle and asked, Do you still trust people after that? Paul smiled sweetly. I trust in God, and it is He who teaches me to love even when love hurts. When dawn arrived, the embers of the fire still smoldered. The group walked in silence, their steps slow. The road now seemed colder, longer. Timothy walked behind Paul, watching the dust rise and vanish into the air. As the sun rose, he thought of Deimos, of his soft voice, his easy smile, his empty gaze. He felt a pang in his chest. Broken trust is like a cracked vase. Even when glued together, it never sounds the same again. They stopped at dusk. Exhausted Docio fed the fire, but the heat didn't reach their souls. Po, he called softly. What will we do if someone else betrays us? The apostle, looking at the twilight, replied, We will continue to love, even if love costs blood. That is what the master would do. The young man nodded, but a chill grew within him. The faith that had once burned now seemed small, shrouded in ash. The fire burned, but my faith seemed made of ice. Paul, how do you manage to carry on after all this? Timothy asked, looking at the apostle in the dim morning light. After betrayal, persecution, wounds, how does the heart still find the strength to believe? Paulo stopped walking and looked at the horizon. The hills were covered in a soft mist, and the cold wind touched the faces of the two travelers. Because faith, my son, is not made of victories, but of survival, he replied with a slight smile. And every wound is a reminder that I'm still on the path. They walked for hours until they found shelter in the shade of a large fig tree. The group was small now, just Paul, Silas, and Timothy. The silence between them carried the weight of memory. The fire was lit, and the flames reflected the weariness of days too long. Timothy noticed Paul moving away, sitting down on a rock. The apostle removed his cloak, revealing his body marked by old scars. Some still read, others whitened with age. There was a story in them that the young man didn't yet understand. Come, Timothy, Paul said softly. I want to show you what faith does to a man and what the love of Christ does to faith. Timothy approached slowly. The flames flickered and the crackling of the fire was the only sound. Every mark has a name and a memory, Paul continued. This one was in Lystra, when they dragged me out of the city and left me for dead. He touched his wounded shoulder. This one in Philippi, floggings for speaking of forgiveness where there was hatred. Then he pointed to his arm. And this, Timothy, was the price of freeing a man the world had already condemned. The young man watched in silence, his heart heavy. He carefully touched one of the scars on the apostle's arm. And all that pain, was it worth it? He asked in a low voice, almost fearing the answer. Paulo looked up at the starry sky and smiled. Pain is brief. Love is eternal. He paused and added, when the body bleeds, the soul learns to truly love. Timoteo felt his eyes well up with tears. I'm still afraid, he confessed. Afraid of not being strong enough, of not being able to endure what you endured. Fear is human, the apostle replied, placing his hand on the disciple's shoulder. But don't let it stop you from walking. The Lord does not call the strong, He strengthens those who are called. Silas, who had been listening in silence, approached. Paul, how is it possible to preach hope when the body cries out for rest? The apostle looked at his own wounded hands and replied, because hope doesn't come from the body, Silas, it comes from the spirit, and the spirit doesn't bleed, it just loves. For a moment, everyone was silent. The fire cast shadows on the stones and the smell of burning wood mingled with the cold air. Zamosio felt that this moment was more than a conversation. It was a lesson that would remain etched in his soul. When I was a boy, the apostle said, staring into the flames, I believed that serving God would spare me pain. But the gospel is not a refuge for those who flee. It is the call of those who stay even when everyone else leaves. Timoteo nodded, his eyes welling up. So faith is not for those who seek comfort. No, Paul replied. Faith is for those who seek meaning, and meaning often comes with tears. The wind picked up, scattering ash across the ground. The fire flickered for a moment, and Timothy huddled into his cloak. Paula, don't you feel like giving up sometimes? The apostle closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Many times, he smiled sadly. But every time I think about quitting, I remember the hands that lifted me up when everyone else left. It was the love of Christ that sustained me, and it is that love that binds me more than any chain. The young man looked at the scars again and realized there was no shame in them, only purpose. It was as if each wound said, I have been defeated, but not defeated. Time passed slowly. The fire faded to embers, and the moon illuminated the apostle's weary face. Timothy thought of everything they had experienced, the stoning, the escapes, Demi's betrayal, the sleepless nights. And yet Paul remained steadfast. Like a tree the wind tries to topple, but whose roots are too deep to topple. Paulo, he murmured. One day will I have scars like that too. You will, Timothy, the apostle replied gently. Because everyone who truly loves will be wounded because of their love. But remember, suffering passes. The fruit remains. The silence stretched on. The young man lowered his head and for a moment felt ashamed of his doubts. He touched his chest and whispered, if pain is the price, then may my heart learn to pay. Paul smiled, looking at the disciple as a father looks at a son. May your wounds one day tell the same story as mine, the story of a love that did not retreat. The fire was beginning to die down. Only red embers remained on the ground like fallen stars. Timothy stared at them thoughtfully. In his chest, faith and fear still waged a silent battle. But now he understood that one didn't need to destroy the other. The apostle slowly stood up and said, let's rest. Tomorrow the journey continues, and so does love. Timothy looked at him and felt something shift inside him. He realized that the true miracle was not in those who were healed, but in those who remained wounded. Paul, I think I'm beginning to understand. The fear of weakness is more cruel than the pain itself. Paul, sometimes I think that God called me but forgot who I am. Timothy murmured, still looking at the gray morning sky. God never forgets. Son, the apostle replied, adjusting his cloak on his shoulders. It is man who tries to hide when the light gets too close. The road was long and the dry wind stirred up dust along the way. The group headed north toward a small village known for sheltering travelers and merchants. The sun was slowly setting, tinging the hills with gold. Paul walked ahead, Silas close behind, and Timothy watched in silence, carrying a whirlwind of thoughts within himself. After his recent trials, he felt different, stronger on the outside but fragile on the inside. Paul's words echoed, pain is brief, love is eternal. He repeated them in his mind, trying to convince his own heart. When they arrived at the village, they were greeted with curiosity and distrust. The people there knew little about the gospel, but many had heard of the preacher from Tarsus. Paul asked for lodging from an elderly man who lived by the roadside. The old man had a white beard and deep-set eyes that seemed to carry many winters. Welcome, travelers. The voice was but gentle. Come in and rest. There's still bread and fire in this house. As they ate, the old man stared at Timothy intently. The boy felt uncomfortable, not understanding the reason for that look. Young man, the old man said after a while, your face is familiar to me. What is your name? Timothy, sir, he replied politely. The old man's eyes widened in surprise. Timothy, son of Nikon the Greek. The name fell like a stone into the silence. Timothy, yes. How do you know? The man leaned on his staff and sighed. I knew your father many years ago. Paul looked up attentive. Timothy, his heart racing, leaned forward. Did you meet him? Where? Right here in this region. The old man stroked his beard. He was a strong, intelligent man, but blinded by pride. I was a converted Jew and he persecuted me. He said faith in Christ was foolishness. Many brothers suffered because of him. The words cut through the air. Dioteo felt his chest tighten. For a moment, the world seemed to spin. My father did this, he asked, his voice trembling. He did, the old man replied regretfully. But toward the end of his life, I heard he began to question his own gods. Perhaps he regretted it. Timothy lowered his head, his hands trembling in his lap. Paulo watched him silently, in no hurry to speak. The young man took a deep breath, but the pain grew within him. So that's it, he murmured. Does the blood that runs through me belong to a man who hated the name I now serve? Paul approached and placed his hand on the disciple's shoulder. The blood shows where we came from, Timothy, but it is the spirit that shows where we are going. What if my blood condemns me? He asked, tears in his eyes. What if I carry my father's sin within me? No one is judged by the mistakes of another, the apostle replied firmly. God writes new stories with the same names the world tried to erase. The old man moved, looked at the boy. Your father wounded me, but I am at peace seeing his son walking with the Christ he denied. This is redemption. Silence returned to the room. The wind blew against the windows and the fire crackled as if it too could hear. Timoteo looked at the flames and saw in them the image of a past he never knew. His father's face hard and distant and his mother's gaze tender and full of faith, two halves fighting within the same heart. Later, as they left the house, Paul walked beside him. Be quiet, son, I don't know what to say. Part of me wants to cry, another part wants to hide, and neither of us needs to win, the apostle said softly. What matters is that you were chosen, and God doesn't make mistakes in his choices. They walked to the field where the moonlight illuminated the damp ground. Timothy knelt down and began to pray. Lord, if my father's blood rose against you, then purify mine. Let your name be my new inheritance. Paul knelt beside him. Let the old man die and the new man live, said the apostle. So it was with me, and so it will be with you. The prayer echoed through the night like a breath of liberation. But when the wind died down, the young man still felt an invisible weight on his chest. The past seemed like a shadow following him, silent and cold. Paul, he murmured, what if I unknowingly carried the blood of an enemy of God? The apostle looked up to the sky where a lone star shone among the clouds. So, Timothy, it will be through this blood that God himself will show the power to transform enemies into children. So, that's it, Paul. God transforms even the blood that once was against him, Timothy asked as they walked along the stone road, the cold wind touching their tired faces. Yes, son, the apostle replied in a calm voice. That's what makes grace so great. It doesn't erase the past, but redeems it. The journey continued. The cities were left behind, and new peoples joined the faith. But something in the air was beginning to change. The nights, once filled with song, grew silent. The conversations around the campfires lost their easy laughter. There was something different. Something Timothy couldn't name. A shadow moving between them. In recent weeks, messages Paul had sent to the churches had disappeared. Letters disappeared. Messages didn't reach the right people. And strange rumors began to circulate. Some said Paul had changed his words, others that he was preaching only to deceive. The apostle, however, maintained the same serene expression as ever. Paul, don't you realize? Timothy asked one night as they walked in the moonlight. There is someone among us bringing misinformation. People are doubting your word. I understand, he replied calmly. But not every enemy reveals itself early. Then we need to find out who it is. The young man insisted, his voice tense. Paulo stopped and looked at him, his eyes steady, full of patience. It's not a hasty look that reveals evil, Timothy. It's time. The same time that ripens the wheat also reveals the weeds. Timothy lowered his head. He wanted to act. He wanted to protect his master, but Paul's serenity confused him. How could he remain calm when trust was crumbling around him? In the following days they traveled to Iconium where they would preach in a small synagogue. The people welcomed them with joy, but also with sharp questions. One of the leaders confronted them publicly. If you are truly sent by God, why do you say different things in each city? Paulo looked at him serenely. It is not I who change, brother. It is the hearts of the listeners who hear as they wish. The man fell silent, but the murmurs spread among the faithful. Timothy watched everything, his stomach tightening. Later they camped outside the city. Silas lit a fire, and the smell of burning wood mingled with the night's chill. A man in the group, young with a thin beard and a restless look, approached Timothy. Strange what's happening, isn't it? He said with a half smile. So many letters, so many stories. Maybe Paulo isn't who we think he is. Timoteo stared at him surprised. What do you mean by that? I only say what I hear. Some say he talks about freedom but seeks power. The young man walked away, leaving an invisible poison in the air. Timoteo felt his heart sink. What had previously been merely suspicion now seemed to have form. He watched the man from afar, whispering with others, exchanging quick glances as if weaving something in the shadows. Paul, there's a problem, Timothy said later, taking the apostle aside. It's Mark, the new brother who joined us. He talks too much and he says things he shouldn't. Paul listened to him without interrupting. Don't judge yet, son. Evil sometimes uses the disguise of sincerity. What if it's too late when we find out? The young man asked, distressed. Paulo placed his hand on his shoulder. The truth may hide, but it is never lost. When the time comes, it will cry out. In the following days, tension grew. In each village they arrived, rumors preceded them. Some refused to listen to them. Some chased them from the town squares, saying they were false prophets. Timothy saw the pain on Paul's face, but the apostle didn't murmur. He simply prayed. How can you bear all this? The young man asked on a silent night. Because I have learned that lies last as long as God allows. Then they vanish like smoke. Paul replied, Fear not, Timothy. Evil only lasts as long as there is darkness, but the darkness seemed to thicken with each passing day. One morning they awoke to discover that part of the scrolls containing the letters had disappeared. Only the burned fragments remained. Paulo gazed at the ashes with a distant look, but not one of despair. "Whoever does this thinks they are destroying the message," he said. "But what is written here?" He touched his chest. "No one can erase." Timothy remained silent, fighting his anger. He wanted justice. He wanted to confront the traitor, but Paul's calmness made him hesitate. That night, he heard the apostle praying for the one who had betrayed them. "Lord," Paul said in a low voice, "if he was one of us, have mercy." The heart that is lost in deception also needs forgiveness. The young man approached and asked, "Do you still pray for him, even though you know he hurt us?" Paulo looked at him tenderly. "Timothy, when we pray for our enemies, we stop being like the world and we become like Christ." The words sank deep into the disciple's heart, but the anguish remained. Something was about to happen. He could feel it, and the feeling that the enemy was among them kept him from sleeping. A few days later, the truth finally came out. Duck, man with a wispy beard, Mark, had been seen delivering information to Roman officials. By the time they realized it, it was too late. Soldiers had destroyed a group of Christians to whom Paul had written. Timothy stood motionless, his chest tight. Paul, his eyes filled with tears, just clenched his fists and murmured, "Time, it always reveals." The fire that night burned brightly, but the air around it felt cold, heavy, as if the silence itself mourned. Timoteo looked at the flames and saw in them the reflection of the pain that betrayal left, a pain without screams, without visible wounds, but that bled from within. He approached Paulo, his voice breaking. "You trusted him and he destroyed lives. How do you live with that?" The apostle took a deep breath and replied, "Learning that faith also bleeds, Timothy." And when the truth came to light, it was too late to heal the wounds. "Is that how it is, Paul? Does faith also bleed?" Timothy asked, walking beside the apostle through the narrow streets that led to the port. "It bleeds, my son," the apostle replied, his voice weary but firm, "and it is in this blood that it proves its true nature." The cold wind came from the sea carrying the scent of salt and farewell. Paul would be taken to Rome. There were rumors of trial, of accusations that grew like waves. Timothy accompanied him, trying to disguise the fear that gnawed at him. He knew what awaited his master: chains, imprisonment, perhaps death. But the apostle walked as if he were heading home. "Master, I should go with you," the young man insisted. "I can't leave you alone before Caesar." Paul placed his hand on his shoulder. "The gospel is not bound, Timothy. Even if I go, the word remains free." "But what if?" The boy's voice wavered. "What if you don't come back? Then you preach." Paulo smiled slightly. "The flame that God lit in you was made to burn when mine goes out." The ship departed. Carrying the apostle among soldiers, Timothy stood on the dock, his heart torn between faith and despair. The sky once blue darkened like an omen. Days later in Rome, chains clanked on the damp prison floor. The walls were cold and the air smelled of mold and loneliness. Paul had been confined to a small cell with a small window that barely let in light, yet his face remained as serene as ever. "They brought you here like a criminal, and yet you have peace." One of the guards sneered. "Because the true captive is the one who has no hope," Paul replied without raising his voice. Timothy arrived in Rome weeks later. He ran from house to house trying to find out where the apostle was being held. Finally, a brother led him to the prison entrance. "No one can enter," the Roman soldier warned. "Only letters if you want." Timothy handed over a small scroll of papyrus wet with tears. Inside were just 4 words: "Don't give up on me." Days passed. The news was bad. Word spread that Nero intended to make an example of Paul, the end of the preachers of the crucified Christ. The young disciple spent his nights praying in the streets of Rome, sleeping under columns, waiting for some sign. Then one cold morning, a messenger brought him a letter. The seal was Paul's. Timothy's hands trembled as he opened it. He recognized the firm handwriting, even if it was shaky with age. "Timothy, my beloved son, in the faith." The words seemed to pulse in every line. Paulo spoke of the battle he had fought, of the wounds, the victories, and the peace that came from the certainty of duty fulfilled. "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day." Timothy's tears wet the parchment. He felt the weight of each sentence as if his own heart were being ripped out. Paul didn't ask for help. He didn't ask for pity. He simply exhorted, "Be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. Endure hardship like a good soldier. Preach the word. Be instant in season and out of season." Timothy folded the letter, clutching it to his chest. With every word he felt Paul saying goodbye. Not as a defeated man, but as a warrior handing over his sword to another. In the following days, she tried to obtain permission to see him. No chance. The prison was guarded by cruel men, and rumors had it that the sentence had already been pronounced. At night, he would stand at the cell door, praying softly, "Lord, give strength to your servant. May the fire you lit in him never go out." Inside, Paul was also praying. That cold was biting his skin. The chains were heavy, but his spirit remained firm. "Lord," he murmured, "I do not ask for deliverance, I ask for courage. May Timothy learn to fight without a sword and to win without revenge." One afternoon, one of the guards dropped something on the ground near the fence, a scrap of ink-stained cloth, the last part of a letter. Timoteo picked it up and read, "The time of my departure is near, but do not fear. The Lord is with me." The young man fell to his knees, his heart broken. The cold Roman wind seemed to be sweeping away all hope. The streets were filled with rumors of executions, and Paul's name was already being whispered like that of a condemned man. That night, the sky grew darker than ever. The moon seemed to be hiding. Timothy sat by the prison wall, leaned his head against the stones, and wept silently. His master's words echoed in his mind, "Be strong in grace." "How can I be strong, Lord?" he whispered, staring into space. "How can I fight when the warrior who taught me to believe now awaits the sword?" Inside the cell, Paul heard footsteps approaching. The guards opened the iron door, and the sound echoed like thunder. The apostle stood up firm with the serene gaze of someone who could already see the sky. Outside, Timothy felt the ground vibrate with the sound of chains being dragged. His heart sank, and Paul's voice, soft as ever, seemed to penetrate the walls. "The end of a servant is the beginning of a seed. But who will teach me to blossom if the seed has been taken? Who will teach me to blossom if the seed has been taken away?" Timothy murmured, holding on to the cold prison wall. "He still teaches you, even from afar." A soft voice answered behind him. It was Luke, Paul's physician and companion who had arrived from his journey. Paul did not die in vain. What he planted in you, son, no longer depends on his hands, but on yours. Timothy nodded silently. The following days were shrouded in mourning and confusion. Rome seethed with rumors and fear. Christians hid. Letters circulated in secret, and Paul's name, now a martyr, was whispered with reverence and tears. The young disciple wandered the city's alleys like a man who had not yet learned to live without his shadow. Lucas handed him a small leather bag. "Paul asked me to give you this in case something happened to him." Timoteo carefully picked up the object. Inside was some yellowed parchments, a quill, a small bottle of dried ink, and a piece of cloth bearing the master's scent. That night, alone in a simple room, he lit a lamp and began leafing through the papers. They contained travel notes, prayers, the names of brothers and sisters in churches. There were lines of comfort, excerpts from letters he recognized, but also something different, an older parchment, the writing dense and almost faded by time. The top, it read in shaky letters, "The son of error." Timothy's heart raced. He opened the entire scroll and began to read. The text spoke of men who had betrayed the faith, of disciples who had strayed, and at the end, a phrase that chilled the young man's blood. "And the son of error will arise among my people, and will mix love with pride, faith with fear, and zeal with guilt." Timoteo felt his breath catch in his throat. The words seemed to whisper inside his mind, repeating themselves over and over. "The son of error, the son of error." He dropped the parchment onto the table, his heart pounding like a drum. "Lord," he murmured, running his hands over his face. What did Paul mean by that? Was he talking about me? He stood up and began to pace. His mind betrayed him with old memories. His Greek father, his tainted past, his doubts, his fear of failure. Everything he had tried to bury came flooding back. "Perhaps I really am the son of error," he whispered, feeling the tears well up. The blood of an enemy of God, the disciple of a holy man, and now alone, surrounded by shadows. Thunder echoed outside. The lamp flickered, casting vivid shadows across the walls. For a moment, Timothy thought he heard Paul's voice. "Guilt is not the end, Timothy, it is the starting point for repentance." "No," the young man shouted, covering his ears. "If it was about me he was talking about, why didn't he tell me? Why did he write this in secret?" Lucas came in scared. "Timothy, is everything okay?" The boy turned around, clutching the parchment tightly. Did you know that Paul spoke of a son of error? Son of error?" Lucas stepped closer, frowning. "Show me." He read it silently and then sighed. "This scroll is ancient. Paul wrote it years before he met you. He was talking about the false teachers who would arise among the churches, not about you, son." But Timothy couldn't listen. The guilt was already consuming him. "But he wrote, among mine. I'm one of his. He said this about those who would pretend to follow Christ but deny love." "You have denied nothing," Luke replied firmly. "Your heart is sincere, even if wounded." The young man sat down exhausted. He ran his fingers over the worn letters and a tear fell onto the paper. "Then why do I feel so distant from God?" he asked in a whisper. "It's as if the sky has closed because you're trying to prove what's already been forgiven," Lucas said, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Grace isn't a prize, it's a shelter." For a moment, silence reigned. The rain fell outside, beating against the windows, and the lamplight cast golden reflections on Timothy's face. He looked back at the parchment. Each word seemed to glow alive, as if Paul himself was still instructing him. "Perhaps he left this so I would understand," the boy said finally, "that even the children of error can become children of promise." Lucas smiled. "Now you sound like him." But as the night wore on and everyone was asleep, Timothy woke with a start. He dreamed of Paul in prison, hastily writing that text, looking to the future with sad eyes. In the dream, the apostle called him by name and said, "Timothy, guard the gift that is in you before guilt extinguishes it." He woke up sweating, his heart racing. He got up and went to the table. The parchment was still there. He touched it with his fingertips. The paper trembled, or maybe it was he who was trembling. "Lord, if you still speak to me, speak now," he whispered. "Show me if I'm yours or if I'm the error that Paul saw." The wind blew hard, extinguishing the lamp. The room plunged into darkness. Timothy stood there, parchment in hand, feeling the weight of fate on his shoulders. Outside, thunder responded with a crash that shook the ground. The paper trembled between my fingers and the abyss seemed to call my name. "O Lord, if you still speak to me, speak now," Timothy murmured, holding the old parchment close to his chest. "He still talks, son," a voice behind him replied. Timoteo turned startled. It was Lucas, his face drawn and his eyes watery. "Some news has arrived. Plo is still alive." The young man's eyes widened. "What? How?" "They said he had already been executed." "Not yet. He was taken to another deeper prison near the Roman Forum. No one has access, but one of the Christian guards can help us." Timothy's heart raced. For the first time in weeks, he felt hope spark within him. "Then I need to see him." The voice was firm, determined. "Even if it's just for a moment." Lucas hesitated. "It's dangerous. I've lived in fear too long." Timothy took a deep breath. "I can't let the last voice Paul hears be that of silence." Night fell over Rome like a lean blanket. The streets were deserted and a cold wind blew through the stone arches, guided by a servant of the faith who knew the tunnels beneath the city. The two walked in silence. The sound of drops falling from the ceiling and the musty smell mingled with their labored breathing. "There," the guide whispered, pointing to an iron door. "He's at the end of the corridor." Timoteo nodded and entered. The corridor was dark, only a lit torch illuminating the damp walls. Suddenly, he heard the clanking of chains. A figure moved in the shadows. "Paolo," he called, his voice breaking. "Timothy," the weak voice replied, but it still held the same sweetness as before. "I thought you had already moved on." The young man approached the bars. The torchlight revealed the apostle's face, aged thin, but with the same sparkle in his eyes. "Master," Timothy said, and the tears came without warning. "I needed to see you." Paolo smiled. "God is good. He always allows a last meeting with those he loves." Timoteo gripped the bars tightly. "I've been living in doubt. Sometimes I think I carry more shadows than faith." Paul looked up serenely. "The disciple who doubts his own worth is the one who most resembles Christ. Not all pain is punishment. Not all blood is inheritance. You are what Christ makes you, not what the world says you are." The young man fell to his knees. "But I failed, Paolo. I doubted my faith, my mission, even God. And that is why he can still use you," the apostle replied, extending his chained hands through the bars. "The cracked vessel is the one that best reflects the light." Timothy held his master's hands. The cold currents touched his skin, but the warmth of Paul's love warmed everything. "Teach me to be strong like you." "I'm not strong," the apostle replied, smiling sadly. "I've only learned not to run away." Silence. Only the distant sound of the wind rushing through the hallways. Timothy breathed between sobs, and Paulo watched the boy with a father's tenderness. "Listen to me, Timothy," said the apostle. "Take my letter to the brothers, and don't let fear erase what we have planted. A time will come when preaching the truth will be costly. And when that time comes, remember the gospel doesn't need walls to survive. It lives in those who carry it." The young man nodded, wiping away his tears. "I promise, Paulo, even if the world remains silent, I will speak, so my mission is over." Paulo closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. "And yours has begun." Timothy wanted to speak, but his throat closed. He stood there holding those tired hands, trying to memorize the face of the man who had given him everything: faith, courage, and purpose. "I don't want to leave you," he said finally. "No one leaves behind those who carry them in their hearts," the apostle replied. "And if one day fear visits you, remember I was afraid, too, but God always got there first." The guards began to approach. One of them knocked on the fence. "Time's up." Timasio looked desperate. "Just one more minute." Paulo smiled. "Man's time is short, son, but God's is eternal." The young man stood up slowly. The sound of chains moving seemed to mark the rhythm of his goodbye. "Paulo," she whispered, "I will love you until the end of my days, and I will wait for you beyond them," answered the apostle, his eyes shining with tears when the guard closed the cell door. The sound echoed off the walls like the crack of something breaking. Not iron, but soul. Timoteo took a step back, his legs trembling, his chest tight. Lucas was waiting for him at the exit in silence. "Did you see him, G?" he asked. "Yes," Timothy replied. His voice, "And I learned something I'll never forget." What Timoteo looked down the dark corridor where the sound of chains still echoed. That sometimes the goodbye of a man of faith sounds like a heart breaking in half. That the goodbye of a man of faith sounds like a heart breaking in half, murmured Lucas, walking beside Timothy through the damp streets of Rome. "Yes," the young man replied, his gaze lost. "But some pains are seeds, and I know the Master still speaks, even in the silence." The two walked slowly, carrying the weight of their farewell in their souls. Rome slept, and the moon hid behind the clouds. The chill of the early morning seemed to reflect the emptiness that now inhabited Timotheo's chest, but deep down something disturbed him, a distant murmur, a shadow that still haunted him days later when he returned to the house where the Christians met in secret. A familiar face was waiting for him at the door. It was Damas, the same man who had previously betrayed them and disappeared after denouncing Paul. He was thin, pale, and with a haggarded look. "Timothy," he said harshly, "I need to talk to you. It's about your father and about Paul." The name father sounded like a blade cutting through the air. Timothy stared at him in surprise. "What do you know about him?" he asked firmly. "And why should I listen to a traitor?" Dios lowered his head. "Because it's the truth, and it's haunted me since the day I handed Paul over to the Romans." Lucas approached, suspicious. "Be careful, Timothy. The wolf can wear the skin of regret." But the young man raised his hand. "Let him speak." Dios took a deep breath and began. "Years ago, before Paul met you, he was betrayed by a Greek named Nicander, a man who claimed to be his friend, but who revealed to the Jewish leaders where he would preach because of this. Paul was arrested for the first time. Many died and Nicander fled. Timoteo felt his body freeze. "Nicandro," he murmured. "That's my father's name." A deep silence fell over the place. The lamp flame flickered as if the wind had also stopped to listen. "He betrayed Paulo?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Dios lowered his gaze, "and I learned that much later. That's why Paul looked at you that way when he met you. He knew who you were. Did you know?" Timothy brought his hands to his face, stunned. "So he knew from the beginning." Lucas tried to intervene. "Son, don't let yourself be discouraged. The apostle loved you, but the young man didn't hear him. He knew, and yet he asked me to walk with him," he asked, his voice breaking. "I knew," Damas replied, tears in his eyes. "I said, the gospel needed to heal the wound your father opened, and that you would be the sign of God's forgiveness." Timothy's legs weakened. He sat on the stone floor, feeling the weight of a lifetime fall upon his shoulders. Memories came rushing back like a river. The words of the old man who had said, "Your father persecuted Christians," Paul's silence when he saw him hesitate, the patience, the love, the ever-tender gaze. Everything made sense now. "So," he murmured, "he carried this pain in silence so as not to hurt me." "Yes," Demis confirmed. "And he told me something before he died, that forgiveness is the greatest act of strength a man can learn." Lucas knelt beside the young man. "But Timothy, listen to me. Paul didn't hide the truth from you out of fear. He protected you from guilt." But the boy cried in silence. "I was always trying to be worthy of him, and he already loved me, even though he knew my father's blood had betrayed him." The traitor looked at him with sincere regret. "I came to confess because I can't bear the weight anymore. Paulo forgave me even when I betrayed him, and if he could love me, maybe there's still hope for me." Timoteo looked at him with teary eyes. "The same forgiveness he gave me, I give you now. Not because I deserve it, but because of mercy." Demos fell to his knees, sobbing, "Thank you. I just wanted peace." "Then receive it," Timothy said, placing his hand on his head. "May the God who forgives us make all things new." For a moment, silence filled the room. It was as if the Holy Spirit hovered over that small group, transforming pain into redemption. Guilt dissolved, and in its place, something new was born. Light, luminous, eternal. Lucas sighed, moved. "Paulo's love lives on in you, son." Timoteo lifted his face, wiping away the tears. "Perhaps the true miracle is not healing bodies but healing hearts that never believed they deserved forgiveness." The distant sound of bells from the streets echoed through the house, mingling with the suppressed weeping and the crackling of the lamplight. Zimotio looked up at the sky through the small window. "Paulo, you knew everything, and yet you believed in me." She smiled through tears. "Now I understand what you meant when you said grace is greater than the past." Lucas stood up. "What are you going to do now?" "Continue," the young man replied. "Because his story doesn't end with me, it begins." A sweet silence fell and the air felt lighter. Timothy looked at Demos, who was still crying, and helped him to his feet. His repentance was sincere, and his pain was mingled with hope. The young disciple took a deep breath, looking at the parchment he still carried with him, the very one that had tormented him, which read, "The son of error." Now the words no longer hurt. He understood finally that error can be the soil from which God brings forth forgiveness. "Timothy," Luke said, his voice thick with emotion, "Paul called you son. Now do you understand why?" "Yes," the young man replied, smiling, "because his love never needed reasons." And as he said this, he felt peace fill the empty space he had previously called pain. The tears dried in his heart, previously torn between guilt and fear, became whole for the first time. "I finally understood that true love doesn't need reasons to continue." "Because true love doesn't need reasons to continue," Lucas murmured, looking at Timothy, who was still holding Paul's old parchment. "And it is for this love that I must continue," replied the young man, straightening his body, his gaze firm, but his heart restless. The days in Rome grew long. Paul's name echoed in the hidden churches, and the people mourned his absence. It was as if the world had lost a voice, but within Timothy, that voice still spoke. He remembered every word, every piece of advice, every prayer of the Master. and the more he remembered, the more he felt the weight of responsibility grow upon his shoulders. One night, Lucas found him sitting silently before the lamp. "You've been very quiet, Timothy. I'm scared." "Lucas," he confessed, "the mission is mine now, and I don't know if I'm ready." "No one is ready when God calls," the doctor replied tenderly. "We just learn to obey, even trembling." Timoteo watched the fire flicker. Shadows moved across the walls like ghosts from the past. Paul was strong. He knew what to say, when to be silent, how to act. "Sometimes I don't even know how to pray properly." "It was not Paul's strength that sustained you, son," said Luke. "It was the Spirit that dwells in the weak." The next morning, a message arrived from Macedonia. There was persecution in Philippi, and the believers were asking for help. Everyone expected Timothy to be the first to respond, but he hesitated. "What if I fail?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. "What if I don't do what Paulo expected?" Lucas approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Paul didn't expect you to be like him, Timothy. He expected you to be what God called you to be." The young man closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time in weeks, prayed without words, just his heart open. Amidst the silence, he felt something gentle, a distant memory, the Master's steady voice echoing in his mind. "God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind." The tears came, but they were no longer of fear. They were of surrender. He stood up and said in a trembling voice, "Then let it be as God wills. I will go." The next few hours were spent preparing. The brothers gathered provisions. Luke organized the letters. And Timothy, Paul's scroll clutched to his chest, set out before dawn. The road ahead seemed too long, but there was something new in his steps, a rhythm that blended faith and uncertainty, courage and weakness. On the way, he prayed quietly, "Lord, don't let me walk alone if Paul walked for you. Let me follow in his footsteps until I see your light." When he reached the first village, he found the people hiding in fear. Soldiers had arrested preachers, burned scrolls of scripture, and threatened families. Timothy looked around and felt the same dread tighten in his chest. But a child approached and asked, "Are you Paulo's friend?" He smiled, even with tears in his eyes. "Yes, I am." "Then tell us about Jesus," said the boy. "It's been so long since we heard." These words were like a gentle blow, opening his heart. Timothy climbed onto a rock and began to speak, his voice trembling at first, but soon firm. "Brothers, Paul is gone, but the Christ he proclaimed lives. He is with us in our prisons, in our losses, and even in our fear." People approached one by one. Elderly people wept, children sat on the ground, and the small crowd listened attentively. The Spirit seemed to breathe in the air, and what had been fear turned into strength. At the end, an elder stood up and said, "I have never seen such new and lively faith. You are truly the son of Paul." Timothy smiled. "No, Father, I'm a son of the same God who sent you." As night fell, he sat alone under the stars. The cold wind touched his face, and he thought of everything that had happened. His father's past, the betrayal, the forgiveness, his master's goodbye. It had all brought him here to the brink of what he had once feared most, leading not by choice but by calling. Lucas approached, bringing him a cloak. "You look different," he said. "There's light in your eyes." Timothy looked to the sky and replied, "I don't know if it's light, Lucas, or just the reflection of the faith that Paul left in me." The doctor smiled, sitting beside him. "Faith is like that. It begins as a memory and ends as a flame." "I'm still shaking inside," the young man confessed, "but I feel like it's a different kind of shaking." "What kind?" asked Lucas. Timoteo looked at the horizon where the sun was dying in shades of gold and ruby. He took a deep breath and replied with a slight smile that mixed courage and tears. "The tremor of someone who decides to follow, not of someone who runs away. The trembling of someone who decides to follow, not of someone who runs away," Lucas murmured, watching Timothy in the evening light. "Yes," the young man replied, adjusting his cloak. "Because now I understand that courage is not the absence of fear. It's walking in spite of it." The following weeks brought an eerie silence. The villagers were restless. Rumors came from all directions. New arrests, new executions. The Roman Empire intensified its persecution of Christians, and many brothers fled to the mountains, but Timothy remained. "We must go." "Timothy," Lucas advised, concerned. "Your voice is too valuable to be silenced by a sword. If I run away, who will take care of those who don't have the strength to run?" he replied calmly. "Paul didn't teach me to run away from the cross. He taught me to carry it." That night, Timothy gathered his disciples in a hiding place. The smell of burning oil and fear filled the air. His hands trembled, but his voice was firm. "Brothers, the fire is coming, but remember, the fire that destroys the body does not extinguish faith. The flame that Paul lit still lives here," he said, pointing to his chest. "They will burn temples. They will burn names, but they will never burn the love of Christ." A woman wept in the corner holding her small son. Timothy knelt down and held her hands. Do not fear. When pain comes, remember heaven is never far enough away for God not to hear your cry. But that morning the inevitable happened. The hideout was discovered. Doors were broken down, torches were raised, and screams were heard in the darkness. Roman soldiers entered in ranks, dragging everyone out. Timothy couldn't resist. He looked up at the sky and simply murmured, Lord, give me strength not to deny your name. They led him in chains through the streets of Ephesus where the people watched with fear and pity. The stones pricked his bare feet. Some insulted him, others wept silently. Luke tried to intervene but was restrained by the guards. Timothy, he cried, tears in his eyes, may the Spirit sustain you. The young man turned his face and replied with a tired smile, He always sustains, brother. Even when the body falls, the soul remains standing. In the square, they tied him to a pillar. The flogging began. Each blow was a thunderclap against his flesh, but his faith was not broken. Timothy prayed softly between his groans, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. One of the soldiers hesitated upon hearing those words. He was young and his eyes trembled with compassion. Why don't you renounce this Christ? He asked in a whisper. You can live if you do. Timothy looked up, his face covered in blood, and replied, If I renounce him, then what would life be? The crowd fell silent. There was something supernatural in that look. The commander ordered them to stop. Timothy could barely stand, but his lips continued to pray, Lord, receive this weary servant. If it is your will, let my blood water the seeds that Paul planted. Suddenly a flash of light illuminated the square. A torch fell to the ground, spreading fire among the dry straw. The heat grew, and the wind blew hard. The soldiers retreated, but Timothy remained motionless, as if looking beyond the visible. Amidst the flames and the pain, something happened. A presence enveloped him, gentle like the touch of a friend. The pain didn't cease, but the fear faded. Paulo, she whispered weakly, I see you. And for a moment, it seemed as if the old apostle was there, smiling from across the fire. Luke, hidden in the crowd, fell to his knees, weeping. He knew that Paul's disciple was not dying. He was simply passing the baton of faith to another generation. The screams ceased and the square was filled with a strange silence. Timothy's body fell, but the flame remained burning in the words that echoed in every heart. Do not be afraid. Faith is greater than death. Later, as night fell, Lucas and some brothers managed to recover their friend's body. They prayed around him with tears and gratitude. He won, Lucas said, his voice breaking. The same fire that took him now fuels our courage. The wind blew over the city, spreading the scent of smoke and hope. And among the disciples, someone murmured, He didn't run away. Lucas closed his eyes and replied, No, he learned from the Master. He understood that God's love does not free us from pain, just teaches you how to cross it. Just teach us how to cross it, Lucas repeated, looking at the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise. Time had passed, but Timothy's name lived on among the brethren. Many years had passed since that night in Ephesus. Rome now slept in apparent peace, and the churches grew in the shadow of persecution. Inside a simple house, amidst scrolls of parchment and lit lamps, an elderly man wrote with effort. His gray hair fell over his forehead, and his trembling hands betrayed the weight of years. It was Timothy, Paul's disciple, the son of Eunice and Lois, the young man who once doubted, and who now, as an old man, understood what it means to live by faith. The wind blew through the window, rustling the worn curtains. He looked up and whispered with a slight smile, Paul, my father in faith. I continue. I still write as you taught me. He picked up his quill and dipped it in the ink. Each word was a prayer, each line a piece of his soul. He wrote not for himself, but for those who would come after, those who would face their own fears, their own crosses. Children of faith, he murmured as he wrote, remember, we are not called to the glory of men, but to the service of God. Hope is the flame that does not go out, even when the wind of the world blows strongly. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he was the young man from Lystra again. He remembered his mother's voice, his grandmother's prayers, Paul's steady gaze. He remembered the day he doubted himself, and the moment the apostle called him son. He all started with pain, he said softly. But the pain was only the seed. A young disciple entered the room, interrupting his thoughts. Father Timothy, the brothers are gathered outside. They want to hear more of your memories. The old man smiled, but his voice was weak. Tell them I can't today. There's something I need to finish first. The boy hesitated. Will you write another letter? The last one, he replied calmly. The one I will leave for those yet to be born. The disciple nodded and left in silence. Timothy returned to the parchment. The quill scratched the paper slowly, but each stroke seemed charged with eternity. I fought fear as Paul fought prisons. I loved people as the Lord loved the cross. And now I understand the secret of my life was not the blood I inherited, but the spirit that transformed me. He stopped. He took a deep breath. The tears fell slowly. The man I was died in every loss, but the servant I am was born in every renunciation. He looked out the window. The sky was golden, and the distant sound of bells seemed to come from the time when Paul still preached in the public squares. Timothy felt his heart lighten as if the Master himself were near once more. Lord, he prayed, if faith is a path, then I now see where it ends in you. For an instant he heard a soft voice in his heart, the same one that had guided him from Lystra, the same one that had echoed in Paul's words, "Be strong in grace." Timothy smiled. The fear that had haunted him throughout his life was gone. Only peace remained. He took the last piece of parchment and wrote with the firmness of someone who can see beyond time. Those who come after me do not fear. God's love is not a memory of the past. It is a presence in the present. The Christ that Paul revealed is the same one who lives in me and will live in you. The flames of the lamps began to die down, but he continued writing. The faith is not the absence of pain. It is going through it with your eyes fixed on eternity. The quill slipped from his tired fingers. He rested his hands on the parchment and closed his eyes. For a moment, the room seemed to fill with a soft light as if the sky itself were bending down to receive him. The young disciple entered, noticing the silence. He approached and saw the old master leaning over the table, his face serene. Beside him, the still damp parchment bore his last words. He read them aloud, tears falling onto the text. Paul has departed, but the Christ he revealed has never departed from me, and I write so that you may know. Faith does not end where fear begins. It is there that it is born. The boy raised his eyes to the sky and whispered, moved, "Thank you, Lord, for leaving us the example of a man who believed even when the world was falling apart." The wind blew through the window, making the flames flicker and gently carrying the parchment to the floor. It felt like a sigh, the last of a faithful servant, and the first of a new generation that would learn from his story. Outside, the bell of the small church rang 3 times, announcing the dawn, and the voice that once spoke in Paul now echoed in Timothy, and in all who would yet choose to believe. Time passed, and the young apprentice from Lystra became more than a disciple. He became a pillar of faith. Timothy, the one who once doubted himself, was now remembered as a guide, a shepherd, a man shaped not by the absence of pain, but by the way he navigated each wound with hope. The trials didn't break him, they shaped him. Every tear was a seed, every silence a prayer, and every loss a reminder that faith isn't measured by the answers we receive, but by the courage to continue even without understanding the path. Timothy discovered that true faith is not made of certainties, but of trust, that God's love doesn't stop storms, it just teaches us to walk on water, and that the meaning of life isn't in running away from pain but in allowing it to transform us. He understood that the truth, however harsh it may seem, is always liberating. That there is no victory without the cross, no light that isn't born from some dark night. And above all, he learned that service is the greatest form of victory. His legacy was not one of fame, power, or conquest, but of example, a man who dared to love when the world hated him, who taught forgiveness when the heart yearned for revenge, who believed that faith could flourish even amidst ruins. What does Timothy's journey teach us? Fear of the unknown. Like him, we tremble in the face of uncertainty, but fear is not a sign of weakness. It is the starting point of faith. The difficult decisions. Timothy learned that the right path isn't always the easiest, and that when we choose the truth, even alone, we are never truly alone. The price of truth. Being faithful is costly. He lost friends, comfort, and freedom, but he gained something the world cannot take away: peace, the greater purpose. In the end, Timothy understood that we don't live just to survive, we live to serve. His life showed that the love we give is what endures, even when everything else fades away. And what does this mean for us today? When we face difficult times, let us remember every pain is an invitation to mature the soul. When we doubt ourselves, let us remember that even the saints had days of fear, but they carried on anyway. When the world asks us to be silent in the face of injustice, may we have the courage to speak with love as he did. And when discouragement wants to make us stop, may the memory of Timothy tell us it is not the end, it is the beginning of something eternal. Timothy is gone, but the echo of his faith still echoes through time. He left us more than a story, he left us a mirror. Because each of us carries within us a disciple in the making, a heart still learning to trust. He discovered that the secret of life is walking with God, even when you don't understand the way. That love is stronger than death, and that no tear is wasted when offered to heaven. Today, Timothy's legacy continues in every person who chooses to forgive, serve, and remain faithful even when it's hard. And looking at its history, a question remains in the air, soft as a voice that crosses the centuries. What truth are you willing to carry to the end? If this story spoke to you, don't let it end here. 2 more videos will appear on your screen. Continue discovering the secrets and lessons the Bible still holds for us. Subscribe, like, and share. May the same God who strengthened Timothy in the midst of pain also strengthen your faith today, because sometimes the courage to continue is the greatest act of worship.